December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay frozen under a bitter winter sky, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of tanks. In the chaos of Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, an elite German commander stumbled upon what seemed like salvation. 50,000 gallons of American fuel, enough to keep his division moving and perhaps alter the course of the offensive. But as SS Colonel Joachim Paper stood among those abandoned barrels, a chilling realization struck him. This wasn't a lifeline, it was a death sentence. For in that moment, Paper understood the terrible truth. America's war machine had so much fuel it could afford to leave oceans of it behind, while Germany's armies starved for every drop. This single discovery revealed that the Reich was not just losing a battle, it was losing the war itself. The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a frozen cathedral of silence and shadows. Towering pines bent under the weight of snow, their branches forming dark vaults over the narrow country roads. The stillness was deceptive. Beneath the quiet lay one of the greatest gambles of World War II, a last-ditch attempt by Adolf Hitler to reverse the war's tide in the West. It would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate offensive launched with fading armies and dwindling supplies. Among those tasked with carrying out the impossible was SS Colonel Joachim Paper, commander of the spearhead unit Kampfgruppe Paper. At just 29 years old, Paper had already earned a fearsome reputation. Handsome, ambitious, and utterly devoted to the Waffen-SS, he was the kind of officer Hitler counted on to turn the tide with sheer audacity. His orders were clear: punch through American lines, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and drive deep into Belgium. If successful, Paper's unit would split the Allied front and perhaps even reach Antwerp, forcing Britain and the United States to sue for peace. But behind the rhetoric and orders lay a crippling problem: fuel. German divisions were ghosts of their former selves, their tanks starved for gasoline. Panzer divisions that once rolled with hundreds of tanks now advanced with a fraction. Many of Paper's mighty Tiger IIs, the most fearsome tanks in the world, had already been abandoned or hidden in forests simply because they could not move. The offensive itself was less a show of strength than an act of desperation, gambling everything on surprise, speed, and luck. The men under Paper pushed forward with grim determination, but every mile carried the weight of dread. Each time the fuel gauge dipped toward empty, each time a tank sputtered to a halt, the fantasy of victory grew thinner. Paper himself, though outwardly confident, understood the cruel math of war. Without fuel, tanks were nothing more than immobile steel coffins. Then came the moment at Hansfeld. In the chaos of the offensive, Paper's column rolled into the small Belgian village and stumbled upon something extraordinary: an abandoned American fuel depot. Row after row of barrels gleamed in the pale winter sun, silent sentinels of petroleum wealth. His men counted quickly, tens of thousands of gallons. 50,000 gallons. Enough to keep an entire panzer division moving for days, perhaps weeks. For a fleeting moment, hope surged. Soldiers cheered, mechanics rushed forward, and engines roared back to life as precious gasoline filled the tanks. It was as if fate had intervened, handing the Germans exactly what they needed to continue the offensive. Yet as Paper stood among the barrels, a very different thought began to form. He knew how tightly rationed German armies were, how carefully every drop of fuel had to be allocated. And now here, in this obscure Belgian village, the Americans had left behind more gasoline than most German corps would see in 6 months. To them, it was a minor loss. To him, it was a devastating revelation. This wasn't salvation. It was evidence. Evidence that Germany was fighting not a winnable war, but a hopeless one. In Paper's own words later, he admitted that discovering that depot was the worst thing that could have happened. For in that frozen winter moment, he realized the truth. They weren't struggling for victory. They were participating in their own funeral. By the winter of 1944, Germany was a shadow of the military power that had once dominated Europe. The Reich's armies had been pushed back on every front. Soviets closing in from the east, Allies advancing from the west. Cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing, railways shattered, oil fields captured or destroyed. The Reich that had once blitzed across Europe now staggered, crippled not by lack of courage, but by lack of resources. The greatest shortage of all was fuel. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, and by late 1944, the Wehrmacht was dying of thirst. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, built to compensate for lack of natural oil, were hammered day and night by Allied bombers. Romania's Ploiești oil fields, once Hitler's prized supply, were lost to the Soviets. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. While America was producing 1.8 billion barrels of oil annually, Germany scraped together barely 33 million. Every German offensive, every tank operation, every truck convoy had to be measured against fuel rations that dwindled by the week. Crews often abandoned tanks not because they were destroyed, but because they simply couldn't move. Training exercises were canceled. Pilots flew fewer missions. Soldiers marched on foot while their vehicles sat idle. In a war of machines, Germany was being strangled. And yet, in the midst of this collapse, Adolf Hitler made his boldest, perhaps maddest decision. He would gather his remaining armored strength and launch one last offensive through the Ardennes forest, splitting the Allied front, capturing Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies to negotiate. He believed surprise, weather, and sheer willpower could overcome shortages. It was a gambler's throw of dice on a bloodstained table. The Ardennes was chosen because of its history and terrain. In 1940, Germany had smashed through the region in its blitzkrieg against France. In 1944, Hitler hoped lightning might strike twice. American divisions there were considered green, inexperienced, and unprepared for a massive assault. If the Wehrmacht could achieve breakthrough, the road to Belgium's ports might once again lie open. But behind the optimism lay cruel reality. German generals knew the offensive's Achilles heel was logistics. Panzer armies consumed staggering amounts of fuel, hundreds of thousands of gallons each day. And Hitler had barely enough reserves to start the operation, let alone sustain it. Entire battle plans were built around capturing Allied fuel depots along the way. Without seizing gasoline, the offensive would grind to a halt within days. Into this impossible mission marched Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Joachim Paper's column was designed for speed and shock. At its core were the dreaded Tiger II tanks, supported by Panthers, half-tracks, artillery, and thousands of seasoned SS troops. Their task: break through American lines, race westward, and capture crossings over the Meuse. Success depended on speed. Every delay, every skirmish, every drop of fuel mattered. As the offensive began on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest erupted with fire. German artillery thundered in the largest barrage since 1940. American positions were smashed, villages overrun, convoys ambushed. Snow and fog grounded Allied planes, giving the Germans the cover they desperately needed. For a brief moment, it seemed the gamble might work. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed. American resistance stiffened quickly. Roads clogged with wrecks and mud slowed the advance. Fuel trucks in Paper's column ran dry. Engines sputtered. Tanks halted. Mechanics cannibalized vehicles for fuel just to keep moving. Men eyed their dwindling reserves with dread. The offensive that had begun with thunder now risked stalling in silence. And then, as if by miracle, came the barrels at Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons of American fuel, abandoned in haste. Soldiers cheered as pumps whirred and tanks drank deeply. Engines roared to life. For a moment, it seemed the gods of war had smiled. But Paper wasn't celebrating. Standing among those barrels, he understood something others didn't. If the Americans could leave behind such a treasure without blinking, it meant their reserves were beyond comprehension. Germany's entire offensive had been built on capturing fuel that was, for the Americans, disposable. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Paper's discovery was more than gasoline. It was a revelation, the moment a hardened SS commander realized that Germany was not just losing battles, but losing history itself. With their tanks refueled from the barrels at Hansfeld, Paper's Kampfgruppe thundered forward once more. Snow muffled the roar of engines, but the ground shook as the armored column pressed westward, steel monsters grinding through Belgian villages and winding forest roads. For the moment, momentum seemed theirs again. Paper's men had gasoline in their tanks, ammunition in their belts, and orders to drive relentlessly toward the Meuse. The Americans were stunned by the ferocity of the assault. Green divisions, some barely blooded in combat, suddenly found themselves facing Germany's elite SS armor. Villages that had been quiet only days before now erupted in fire and chaos. Columns of American trucks were ambushed, their drivers shot down in the snow. Prisoners, captured in droves, trudged eastward under guard. But behind the apparent success lay something darker. Kampfgruppe-Paper's advance was not simply a military mission. It became a symbol of the brutality and desperation that marked the last months of the Reich. At places like Bühlingen and Malmedy, Paper's men executed American prisoners, shocking the Allies and hardening their resolve. While historians still debate Paper's exact role in these atrocities, the shadow they cast would forever stain his name. For the Americans, these massacres were more than war crimes. They were a rallying cry. News of murdered GIs spread like wildfire, stiffening resistance and ensuring that Paper's men would be hunted with vengeance. For the Germans, it was a grim reflection of their own unraveling. An army no longer fighting for victory, but lashing out in rage as defeat loomed. Yet even as the spearhead pressed forward, the fuel gauges told the real story. Every mile deeper into Belgium brought Paper's column closer to the end of its reserves. Even with the windfall at Hansfeld, his tanks burned through gasoline faster than they could replace it. Every detour, every skirmish, every burning village was another nail in the coffin. Meanwhile, American logistics flowed like a river. Convoys of trucks, known as the Red Ball Express, delivered endless supplies from ports in France. Fuel dumps, airfields, and depots stretched across liberated territory in staggering numbers. The contrast was humiliating. German troops scavenged for barrels in snow-covered villages, while Americans lit cigarettes with gasoline-soaked rags and powered entire armies without hesitation. For Paper, the discovery at Hansfeld grew heavier in his mind. What had seemed a miracle now haunted him. The barrels were not a gift from fate, but a mocking reminder of the imbalance that doomed his mission. Each time he looked at his fuel gauges, he saw not just dwindling gasoline, but the futility of Hitler's grand gamble. Still, Paper pressed on. Orders were orders, and the men of the 1st SS Panzer expected nothing less than iron will from their commander. They drove westward, capturing villages, clashing with American units, leaving destruction in their wake. Yet with every passing hour, their dream of reaching the Meuse grew dimmer. Roads clogged with wreckage, resistance stiffened, and their precious fuel vanished gallon by gallon. What kept them moving wasn't strategy, it was desperation. They were the tip of a spear that no longer had a hand to throw it. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allies was instead unraveling under the weight of its own shortages. And so, even as Kampfgruppe-Paper carved its name into the snowy fields of Belgium, the shadow of Hansfeld loomed. The barrels they had found weren't salvation, they were prophecy. Prophecy of a war already lost, of an army marching toward its own demise, of a nation undone not by lack of courage, but by lack of oil. By late December 1944, the spearhead of Kampfgruppe-Paper no longer cut through Belgium like a knife. It dragged itself forward like a wounded animal. The first rush of success, fueled by the barrels at Hansfeld, had faded. What remained was a grinding, desperate struggle against terrain, weather, and an enemy that refused to yield. The Ardennes, so easily crossed in 1940, had turned against its would-be conquerors. Narrow forest roads choked with mud and ice could not handle the weight of German armor. Paper's massive Tiger IIs, more than 70 tons each, were nightmares to maneuver. When one tank slid off a frozen slope, it blocked entire columns for hours. When engines failed, they had to be abandoned. Mechanics had no fuel to waste on repairs. And the Americans were no longer caught off guard. Word of the German offensive spread, and reinforcements poured in. U.S. engineers blew bridges before Paper could reach them. Roadblocks sprung up, manned by determined GIs who fought with bazookas, rifles, and artillery. What had been a daring thrust now slowed to a crawl. Fuel gauges told the cruelest truth. Paper's tanks guzzled gasoline faster than they could capture it. Each firefight consumed ammunition and fuel they could not replace. The barrels from Hansfeld had bought time, but not victory. Now, every mile westward was another step into a trap. The countryside bore witness to the desperation. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadsides. Dead livestock froze in the fields. Civilians huddled in basements, their villages reduced to ruins as German and American fire clashed over their homes. For the people of Belgium, this last German offensive was not liberation or conquest, it was suffering. As paper pushed toward the town of Stavelot, the resistance only grew. American artillery rained down, tanks appeared at crossroads, aircraft returned once the fog lifted. The Allies' supply system worked like a living organism, feeding reinforcements into the fight faster than the Germans could destroy them. For every tank paper knocked out, 2 more seemed to arrive. For every barrel of fuel seized, thousands more flowed to the Allies from ports on the Channel. By Christmas Eve, the spearhead was spent. Surrounded by American units, low on ammunition, and with fuel tanks nearly dry, paper faced the inevitable. The once mighty Kampfgruppe, hundreds of vehicles strong, was reduced to a cluster of exhausted men, their tanks silent, their hope extinguished. Paper made the only choice left. He ordered his men to destroy their vehicles. Explosions echoed through the forest as tigers, panthers, and half-tracks were blown apart by their own crews. The snow was littered with the charred hulks of what had been Germany's last armored gamble. Then, under cover of night, Paper and his men slipped away on foot, abandoning their steel beasts to the Ardennes winter. The retreat was grim. Hungry, cold, and hunted, they trudged through forests and villages, avoiding American patrols. Many would never make it back. For those who did, the memory of that march burned deeper than any victory. They had witnessed firsthand the futility of Hitler's gamble, the reality of Germany's defeat, and the meaning of those barrels at Hansfeld. For Paper himself, the irony was cruel. The barrels that had once seemed salvation had only prolonged the inevitable. His men had burned through 50,000 gallons, but in the end, they could not outrun history. Germany's war machine had stalled, not for lack of courage or strategy, but for lack of oil. While Paper and his men abandoned their tanks in the snow, far from the battlefields, another story explained why Germany's gamble had been doomed from the beginning. It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of fuel tanks, refineries, and oil fields. The United States, by 1944, had become the greatest oil-producing nation in human history. American refineries pumped out more than 1.8 billion barrels of oil during the war, while Germany scraped together just 33 million. That ratio, more than 50 to 1, was not just a statistic. It determined the fate of every tank, every airplane, and every soldier. Paper had seen it firsthand at Hansfeld. More gasoline sitting in one American depot than most German divisions could dream of in half a year. The sheer waste stunned him. To the Germans, fuel was sacred, carefully rationed, guarded, and fought over. To the Americans, it seemed endless, something they could abandon, spill, or even burn to deny to the enemy. Across Europe, American supply lines became the envy and terror of the Wehrmacht. Endless convoys of trucks, nicknamed the Red Ball Express, carried gasoline in 5-gallon jerrycans by the millions. Pipeline networks were laid under the English Channel, pumping fuel directly from Britain into France. Tankers crossed the Atlantic in massive convoys, carrying liquid gold from Texas and Louisiana refineries straight to the front lines. By contrast, Germany's synthetic fuel plants struggled under relentless Allied bombing. The oil fields of Romania, once Hitler's lifeline, were destroyed. The Luftwaffe had to cancel missions because pilots couldn't get enough aviation fuel. Panzer divisions sat idle while American tanks rolled forward, fueled not just by gasoline, but by the entire industrial might of a continent. This wasn't merely logistics, it was ideology made physical. Nazi propaganda had promised a 1,000-year Reich, powered by conquest and discipline. But in the Ardennes, a few hundred barrels of abandoned American fuel had kept Paper's offensive alive for a week. Meanwhile, America burned through millions of gallons every day, supplying its armies, navies, and air fleets across the globe. The Battle of the Bulge, often remembered as a clash of bravery in the snow, was also a war of oil barrels. Germany could launch one last offensive, but it could not refuel it. America could lose thousands of vehicles in battle and replace them within weeks. No tactical brilliance, no surprise attack, could overcome the math of petroleum. And so, when Paper ordered his men to blow up their tanks and retreat, it was not just the end of his Kampfgruppe, it was the physical embodiment of Germany's failure. A Tiger II without fuel was nothing but a coffin of steel. An army without oil was not an army at all. For the men trudging back through the frozen forests of Belgium, this truth became undeniable. They were not just defeated by American soldiers, but by American oil. By late December 1944, what had begun as Hitler's bold gamble to split the Allies and capture Antwerp had unraveled into a brutal retreat. The Kampfgruppe paper, once the spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive, was now reduced to exhausted men on foot, abandoning their frozen, fuel-starved tanks. The dream of victory had collapsed into survival. Paper's capture of the American fuel depot at Hansfeld had seemed like a miracle at the time. Yet, within days, it became clear that even 50,000 gallons of stolen gasoline could not change the strategic reality. The offensive had run headlong into three immovable obstacles: American resilience, Allied air power, and Germany's empty fuel tanks. The weather that had shielded Paper at the beginning soon turned against him. When the skies cleared on December 23rd, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched relentless airstrikes. Fighters and bombers pounded German convoys, shredded supply lines, and destroyed bridges. Every gallon of fuel captured was consumed simply trying to survive. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages, could barely respond. Meanwhile, American soldiers on the ground refused to break. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held out against desperate German assaults. At crossroads and villages across the Ardennes, smaller units of U.S. infantry slowed down Paper's tanks, buying precious time until reinforcements arrived. The Germans had counted on rapid movement, surprise, and momentum. Instead, they found themselves bogged down, surrounded, and starved of supplies. By Christmas Eve, Paper knew the end was near. He could see it in the faces of his men, once proud Waffen-SS soldiers now trudging through snow, hollow-eyed, surviving on captured American rations. Their tanks, the fearsome Tiger IIs and Panthers, stood abandoned in the forests, silent monuments to a failed dream. Each one carried stories of battles fought and won, but without fuel, they were useless. On December 24th, Paper made the decision. They would withdraw on foot. Orders were given to destroy the vehicles, blow the charges, drain the oil, render them inoperable. Flames and explosions echoed through the Ardennes as German soldiers set fire to the very machines that had carried their hopes. For Paper, it was a bitter acknowledgement. He had seen the American supply depots overflowing with fuel, food, and equipment. He had seen how easily the U.S. could afford to abandon what Germany considered treasures. And now he watched as his Kampfgruppe dissolved into the forest, beaten not just by enemy fire, but by the sheer weight of America's abundance. The Battle of the Bulge did not end with a single dramatic clash. It ended with a slow grind of attrition. German units fell back, their casualties mounting. What Hitler had declared a war-winning offensive had become a catastrophe that bled the last reserves of the Wehrmacht dry. In the aftermath, Paper would later admit privately what he already knew at Hansfeld. Germany was fighting not for victory, but for survival against an enemy whose resources were limitless. The captured fuel had given him temporary hope, but it also revealed the truth. The war was unwinnable. When the guns fell silent in the Ardennes, the German dream of turning the tide of war was shattered beyond repair. The Battle of the Bulge had cost Hitler his last reserves of men, tanks, and hope. For Colonel Joachim Paper, the man who had once spearheaded the offensive with steel confidence, the end was humiliating. His once proud Kampfgruppe was reduced to scattered survivors trudging back to German lines, hungry, frozen, and broken. Paper himself barely escaped, slipping through forests with a handful of men after abandoning his tanks and vehicles. For the Americans, his failure was not just a tactical victory. It was a clear demonstration of what truly won modern wars: logistics, resources, and industrial power. The captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel at Hansfeld became symbolic. To the German soldiers, it had at first felt like a miracle, but in reality, it exposed the gulf between the two sides. For the United States, 50,000 gallons was nothing more than a fraction of a single day's frontline consumption. For the Germans, it was enough to fuel dreams of victory, dreams that dissolved within days. Historians later calculated that by 1944, the U.S. produced nearly 1.8 billion barrels of oil annually. while Germany struggled with just 33 million. The math alone doomed Hitler's offensive before the first shot was fired. No matter how skilled German tank crews were, no matter how experienced their commanders, their machines could not move without fuel. And fuel was the one resource America could drown the world in. For the German High Command, the failure of the Ardennes offensive was catastrophic. Thousands of irreplaceable tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles were destroyed. Elite Waffen-SS divisions were gutted, their manpower never replenished. Hitler's gamble had not only failed, it had accelerated Germany's defeat. For the Allies, the lesson was equally powerful. American commanders and soldiers alike saw that victory came not just from courage and tactics, but from the supply lines that fed them. General Patton once said that logistics was the true secret weapon of the U.S. Army, and the Ardennes proved it. Every tank that rolled, every bomber that flew, every infantryman that ate hot rations in the snow was part of an industrial machine so vast that Germany could never compete. As for Paper, his name would forever be linked with both the brutality of war and the futility of Germany's final gamble. He survived the battle, but his division never recovered. He had seen the truth with his own eyes in that American fuel depot. Germany was doomed, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its nation lacked oil, steel, and factories. The story of Hansfeld and those 50,000 gallons is not just about one man or one unit. It is about the end of an era, the moment when German soldiers realized they were no longer fighting a conventional war they could win. They were fighting the industrial age, and America had already won it. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was over, and the road to Berlin lay open. Within 4 months, the Third Reich collapsed, consumed by the very shortages that Paper had confronted in that snowy Belgian village. In the end, the fuel depot at Hansfeld was more than a prize of war. It was a mirror, showing Germany its fate. As Paper himself reportedly reflected, finding that fuel was not a gift but a curse. It revealed that while the Germans were counting every drop, the Americans had oceans to spare. And against such abundance, no amount of bravery or tactics could change the outcome.